All right, so this is a 2018 Nissan March, imported from Japan. And I needed to change the spark plugs because I was getting some dipping in engine power just after restart, and also a smell of unburnt fuel. So the reason I'm making this video is because I could not find anything like this online for this particular vehicle. And I'll double check all the specs and I'll put it in the comments so that you'll be able to match up your vehicle to this one. Now I'm going to do a reassembly, but generally what I wanted to show you is pretty much everything plastic needs to be loosened or removed in order to reach that very last plug. So that coil right there only has about an inch clearance underneath the air intake. I wanted to show you that both the filter housing and the air intake bolts all need to be removed. Now there's one bolt that's down behind the dipstick. It's hidden. You need to get in there. There's a little hole in that intake housing, and you're going to get in there with your number 10 and remove that bolt. I also needed to remove, you could remove those bolts that's holding the throttle to the air, but I don't recommend that because there's actually a hidden bolt back there. I just removed the coupling over here, the clamp for the coupling, loosened these bolts for the intake filter housing, and everything for the air intake itself. I tied up the manifold flange because it's gonna fall and it's gonna go way down, and who knows where it's gonna end up. So I'm not even gonna bother to try to figure that one out. All the hoses need to be removed, and be careful because fluid do leak out of them. So what I'm gonna do now is remove that coil pack and finally get to change that plug. I swear to you, it took me a whole 4.5 minutes to change those two plugs. This one, I've been working on it for about 2 hours, mainly because there are no instructions online. So I just had to figure it out for myself. So I'm actually giving you this information so that you won't have to go through what I went through. And show you exactly what bolts need to go back in, and to take it out, it's obviously the opposite. So I'm just going to change that plug, and I'm going to assume you know how to change plugs. So it's just a matter of removing that number 10, unclipping the electrical, pulling out the coil pack, and then taking your number 14 tool socket to remove the spark plug itself. Now I had a lot of fun. You can buy a number 14 plug socket, but here where I am in Jamaica, hard to find. So what I did was I got a nice number 14 socket, and I used the rubber out of another socket and plugged it up in there. So as you can see, I retrofitted a plug socket here so that my very expensive iridium plugs don't fall into the chamber. So I'll be back very shortly with the reassembly instructions. So this is a change of the spark plugs on the 2018 Nissan March, and they take the iridium plugs. These plugs were the originals that were in the engine, NGKs. I currently have 130,000 kilometers on the car. This is what I'm replacing them with, the 3499 Denso. And you can see, mostly worn, nothing major, carbon buildup, fairly normal. This is just very worn plugs, and that would create the issue with unburnt fuel and a little bit of a dip in the idle after startup. All right, so we're ready to reinstall everything that we've needed to remove in order to access that final plug. I have changed the plug and reinstalled the coil pack. Now, just a few little tips here. Generally, we're just creating enough room by shifting the air intake a little bit in order to access this coil pack and ultimately the plug. Now, these plugs, if you're buying the correct plugs for your car, you know they're not cheap plugs. So you want to make sure that you thread them back by hand and just give them a little twist. They don't need to be torqued, and you don't want them crazy tight either. And what I do recommend is to reinstall the plug on the coil pack just before seating it entirely. That way you're not fighting with it after it's down and installed. Now, I didn't intend to make an instruction video on how to do this, but because it took me about an hour and a half to finally figure out how to get to that last plug, and there was no help online, not for this particular vehicle, I'm doing this for you today. So at this point, we need to reinstall everything, and unfortunately, I can't hold the phone and do this at the same time. Like I said, I wasn't planning on doing this, but generally, we need to get everything seated back properly again and reinstalled. So I'm just going to put the video on hold, and then I'm going to put back the coupling there and seat everything properly, and then I will come back and show you the bolts that I'm putting back in so you know which ones to remove. All right, so generally what I've done is I've just reseated all the components so that they're lined up with the threaded holes, and I've reattached the hose, the intake hose, to the throttle. Now, generally, what we need to do is we need to get all these hoses back where they originally came from. And the biggest issue I had was this one bolt, and it's behind the dipstick. And it's right in that hole there. You can't see it unless you feel it. And I didn't use my phone to look for it. So that particular bolt, it can't even, it doesn't even come out unless you have a tool like with a magnet or something of that sort. That's the only way that's coming out. I actually loosened it with the ratchet, and I've rethreaded it by hand and taken it out by hand. I allowed it to stay in its place, and just now when I was putting everything together, I just made sure that it was seated back into the threaded hole. Now, back here, they're linked up to the flange or the manifold. I tied it up, and I'll show you. I tied it up with a piece of binding wire, and so I'm not losing it on the pipe. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to rethread it by hand, and then that way I'm not going to lose it entirely. All right, so I've removed the wire, the placeholding wire, and you want to reinstall this. So these are both that you would have need to have removed in order to get access to that coil pack. Now, the other areas, so this need to be put back on. We have 2 screws, one to go in the left side we're looking toward, and these are all number 10s. Just tighten them by hand for now, and then I'll go back in with the ratchet after. The other one goes right here. I'll fix that up, but that one, this wire is giving me a little, oh, there we go. Would need to go in as well. And then for the filter housing, you have your 2 bolts that came out from there. One from here, and the other one from here. other than the bolts, this bracket will need to be screwed back in, but that's what I took out in order to just kind of shift the housing over so that I can get underneath it. And you can see now, look at how tight that is. There's no way that you'll be able to get that out any other way than how we just did it. And then there's 3 screws at the front of the intake. And you can see one hole is there. There's our mystery holes, that mystery screw right there, the SOB screw. And then there's another one right there. So, and then one more right back in there. So there's 4 bolts that need to come out from the front. This one, those 2, loosen that, take out these 2 screws, or these 2 screw bolts, unhook that, and that's what we're looking at. Look, it may seem a little bit complicated, but if you have ever changed your oil and your brakes, you can definitely do this. And I'm a girl, and I can do this. So it's just a matter of having a little bit of patience, and just be careful with these plugs. They're very delicate and expensive, so you want to make sure that you're treating them with a lot of care. And I mentioned that I made my own spark plug socket out of a 14mm socket, and I used the rubber from inside of a larger socket for plugs, and made sure that it wasn't going to come out, because the last thing you want to do is get your plug installed, and then when you pull out your socket, you got your rubber stuck on there. Well, that's useless. You don't want to be digging. These chambers for the sockets are quite tight, so you want to try to get as thin of a tool as you possibly can. It will not work with impact at all. No impact sockets will go down in there. Very, very tight. It's a 14mm plug tool, or you can make your own out of a deep socket and a piece of rubber out of an old plug tool. Hopefully this video was helpful for anybody. It was quite a situation, and again, I wanted to make sure that anybody who has one of these cars can quickly figure out how to do this, because there's no instructions online, and it can get a little confusing if you're not 100 on these engines. So make sure you plug all your hoses back in. And again, this bolt, that bolt, unhook that, take out 4 bolts and 1 hidden behind the oil stick. 4 bolts behind there. This bolt, those 2 bolts, and hang up your flang so you don't lose it on the pipe. And then you loosen up that off the housing, and you'll be able to shift everything enough to be able to gain access to that plug. If you like my video, please like and follow.